Latin America just launched its own like ChatGPT thing called LATAM GPT, and it is basically an AI model that they've built using cultural references and language models that are based in Latin America. So it's Spanish and Portuguese and also a lot of indigenous languages. I think it's a very cool innovation in the AI space. And also it shows a little bit of how global policy is moving in terms of digital sovereignty. So in my series, Actually What's Happening, where we're talking about big global issues and we're getting away from breaking news, today I want to talk about digital sovereignty and how it's interacting with the AI race. Digital sovereignty is kind of this idea of like, who owns your data? Do you own your own data? Do countries own their citizens' data? And like, how does that matter in terms of like laws and stuff? But more than that, with AI, it's like sort of complicating the question a little bit. Interestingly, in Kenya this last month, there was a big conference talking about African AI and trying to bring together a coalition of countries there to do a similar type of work. Both Latin America and Africa had infrastructure pieces they want to build that have to do with like gender equality and making sure that privacy is built in and making sure that local languages are built in and the intricacies of how those languages like intersect with justice and law. And I think that's a really, really interesting way to build something from the foundation rather than trying to like adjust something that was made in like the US or whatever. And beyond that, in Southeast Asia, I was reading this interesting article in The Diplomat that was talking about who owns the data center. So in my last video about sovereignty, we talked about how there were laws that were being passed in different countries to make sure that like the data of the citizens of a country is living in data centers that are in that country. And so lots of countries have passed laws in the last like couple years to make it so that they have data centers that hold their citizens' data. But this Diplomat article was saying that that's not actually enough because the AI centers that are like extracting that data to then run the systems for AI are not housed in those countries. They're housed often in China and in the US. And then it pointed to this like New York Times map that actually shows where all the major data centers are around the world. And I thought it was like crazy to see where they're all spread out. And it helped me understand, wow, no wonder the US is trying to build so many data centers within the country right now, because all these countries are racing to try to actually like get their data to be sovereign and also to be able to be like held in their country. And if the US can have the most data centers, it gives a bunch of advantages. But one advantage is that actually a lot of other countries will have to use the data centers that are based in the US to run their queries, which gives the US this like additional soft power, right? Crazy, right? Diplomat, where they actually talked about then different countries in Southeast Asia that have tried to combat this. So like Malaysia has put a bunch of deals in place where they've tried to make sure that like most of their data is held in country, but then they actually showed that like most of that data is extracted and run in like offshore different data centers because they don't have enough data centers in Malaysia. Singapore, on the other hand, has actually put in a nationalized program where they have their own data centers on site, but they don't control those data centers because they're privately owned by US companies like Amazon and Microsoft. And so there are all these kind of problems about like, well, what would happen if the like country of Singapore said, we want these data centers to be run in this way? Who wins in that battle? Is it the government of Singapore, or is it Amazon who actually owns the data center? Is it Singapore who owns the data that's pulling from their citizens' data that's in data centers that are housed on the country? Like, those are big questions that a lot of countries are trying to answer right now. Thomas Friedman had a really interesting opinion column in the New York Times this week also about the way we could regulate AI in partnership with China. So if the US and China worked together to regulate AI, it would actually lead to a much better outcome. And that those regulations could be based on just general human morality clauses, things like we don't want to hurt other people, we don't want to lie. So then I got interested in like, is anybody actually tracking like how AI systems currently deal with controversial subjects of ethics? And there is one, speechmap.ai. So I started looking at that, and you can go there. It's like a free website, and what they're doing is they're actually like asking controversial questions to different AI chatbots and seeing how much they comply, or they'll take you down like a dark road basically. And like, I don't know, my takeaway was like, obviously Grok is pretty scary in terms of what it will teach you to do. And like Claude is probably the most buttoned up in those ways. But we need to have these frameworks in place, and we need measurement tools to make sure the frameworks are actually being followed. And so I'm glad that that kind of thing exists. Finally, that led me back to the US, where there is a group of scientists and AI educators who are running this thing called the Atom Project, where they're trying to create more open source AI software in the US in order to try to like compete a little bit better. And so I think there's a little bit of a mix in digital sovereignty where we want to make sure that we own our own data, and we also want to make sure that things like new technologies are open source as much as possible because they're built for the public good. So how do we make like the right boundaries and structures around these technologies so that we don't harm humanity, but that we also allow the most people access to new technology to create innovation and make humanity better in the future? Next month, I think I'm going to get into like the fragmented and splintered internet, but if you have other thoughts about what I should dig into, please let me know.